Good morning, Year 9. Welcome back. Sorry for the delay in uploading a lesson. Just so you know that yesterday I did try and record this lesson, but then when it came to editing the video, it turned out my mic was turned off. So I spent all that time recording something and nobody could hear what I was saying. So I did cry a little bit internally and externally. And I've decided to have another pop at it today. Let's just say it's a very, very good job that the mic didn't pick up what I was saying when I found out that my mic was actually turned off. But that's another story. Anyway, so we are back. We are going to be continuing our work on the Cold War. Remember, this is all super relevant to your work that you're going to be doing in September. Now, to recap, we want to go back to lesson 4, I believe. I think this is lesson 5. I'm not quite sure. But anyway, you need to go back to the last lesson that talks about the spread of communism in Eastern Europe. And I want you just to jot down your ideas and think about, right, all about perception. The spread of communism in Eastern Europe at the end of the Second World War, after the Second World War. What was the perception from Harry Truman's eyes, and what was the perception from Joseph Stalin's eyes? Okay, and then you want to maybe think about these ideologies. Think about maybe whether or not the ideologies meant that this whole idea of, having, quote, free elections in Eastern Europe, maybe that was doomed to fail anyway. So pause the video, jot down your ideas. How did each of the superpowers react to the spread of communism? How was it seen? Pause the video and off you go. Okay, right. So from an American perspective, from Truman's perspective, it, of course, demonstrated that communism was something that should be feared and should be fought, basically. It confirmed Truman's suspicions that communism wanted to spread, or Stalin wanted to spread communism throughout the world, and it was a direct threat to the, quote, freedom of capitalism. And it went against those agreements at Yalta. Remember, we mentioned it before, how I mentioned it at the beginning very, very briefly. It was decided at Yalta that in Eastern Europe that had been, quote, liberated by the Red Army, the Russian army, at the end of the Second World War, because this whole area here was pretty much dominated by Nazi Germany. The idea was to have free elections. Well, from Truman's perspective, those free elections did not happen. They were just dominated by communists. So therefore, from Truman's end, it is very much a confirmation that Stalin and the USSR should not be trusted. And from Stalin's perspective, on the other hand, it was very much a case of, well, Eastern Europe is right next door to the Soviet Union, next to Russia. So therefore, it is perfectly legitimate for Stalin to want to have a say in what is going on in those Eastern European countries. He cannot have, remember, capitalism to him is a direct threat, isn't it? It's completely opposite. So what he wanted to do is to make sure that those countries were communist, so that they would be friendly towards the Soviet Union. And their friendliness towards the Soviet Union and being allied to the Soviet Union is absolutely imperative, because it was going to act as a buffer zone against a future attack from the West, particularly Germany. 3 times in the 20th century, 3 times in the 1900s, Russia had been attacked from the West. Twice by Germany, once during the First World War and once during the Second World War, of course. And during the Second World War, tens of millions of Russians were killed because of the conflict during the Second World War. And he was determined never to see anything like that happen against Russia ever again. However, there is a trust issue from Stalin, aside from his natural paranoia and suspicion of everybody. You've got the idea that, well, the idea at Yalta was also that once the war against Germany had been won, that Russia was going to join the war in the Pacific, to join America in that war against Japan. Why? Well, Russia wanted some islands over in Asia, but that's another story. So Truman went ahead and used the atomic bomb without consulting Stalin. And that to him demonstrated that further need for protection, further need for that barrier, because the West had said absolutely nothing to him about the atomic bomb. even though Stalin secretly knew because he was spying on Truman. It's like a really bad love story. And basically it confirmed to Stalin that capitalism and the USA should not be trusted. So, and I think the challenge issue here is what constitutes a free election. If you're thinking back to those ideologies, you're thinking that to capitalism, a free election is all about competing political parties that vie for people's votes, that make offers to the people of how they want to run the country in their manifestos, and then people will vote on it. For Stalin and communism, however, a free election, quote, is all about which communist are you going to choose to run the country based on the decisions of the USSR, basically. So you can see that there is this difference of perspective, isn't there? There is a huge gulf in understanding, and there is no wish or desire to understand one another. So that is very, very important. So our question is today, if you want to do it old school, literally, and get into those good habits before September, that would be good. If you want to get a date and a title on your book or bit of paper, whatever you're working on, how did the USA respond to the Iron Curtain? Today is the 3rd of July because I've finally got around to recording this bad boy. And we are going to identify how the USA reacted to this Iron Curtain that we will talk about later on. And we will infer views from both West and East about the spread of communism. Okay, and you will look at some sources very similar to how you did in your December assessment, which feels like forever ago, but it is a key skill that you need to get to grips with for September. So if you want to jot all that down, do so. So the date and the title are the important things. So I'm going to move on, and we do need to just recap this little change of personnel here. On the left-hand side, February 1945 at Yalta, we have got Franklin Delano Roosevelt along with Stalin. Remember, that was before the Second World War had actually come to an end. And here we've got Truman and Stalin on the right-hand side. Now, what happened in May 1945 was FDR dropped dead of a stroke. His final words, I believe, while having his portrait taken, I think it was that he had an incredible headache and then he collapsed and never got up again. Now, he was somebody who was more of a pragmatist, which means you sort of work with what you've got, really. He recognized that although he did not like Stalin and communism particularly, if at all, he recognized that communism in the world, and communism particularly in Russia, was not going anywhere, and you had to work with Russia. Remember, during the Second World War, there's an old phrase that says, the enemy of the enemy is my friend. Consequently, they were both on the same side. On the right, however, you can see that in July 1945, after the death of Roosevelt, we are replaced by Truman, Harry S. Truman, the Vice President of the United States, who served under FDR. He had a rather different attitude to the situation in the world, and communism in particular. He, in fact, hated communism. Unlike Eisenhower, he was not prepared to work with communism. His attitude was very much what we call an iron fist. Now, if you're in a classroom with me, I'd probably smash the table with my hand and smash up my bones and my tendons and all the nice things in my hand that make it work. However, and this goes back to him thinking that the USA had been too soft on communism and it was a real threat because it was going to expand across the world. And what he came up with was the Truman Doctrine. And that is a key idea that you need to get your heads around, okay? The Truman Doctrine was basically a commitment by Truman and the United States to help anyone in any country around the world, particularly in Eastern Europe, to resist attempts by communists to take over their country. So it was a commitment to help any group of people in any country to defend against a communist takeover. How that actually manifests itself, we're going to look at later on. All right, but that is fundamental. If you want to jot some of those ideas down, feel free. And we're going to come back to that in September, and we'll come back to that time and time again. Now, A phrase used at the beginning was the Iron Curtain. Now, this video is going to start playing automatically, I think. Might do. Anyway, so this video here, I'm not going to play on this PowerPoint. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put the link to this bad boy on the description on YouTube, and you can watch it. It's a really good summary of what actually the quote Iron Curtain was. And it's something you need to watch before we go forward. So go ahead and watch that. It's about 6 minutes long, and it will give you a good summary of what the Iron Curtain was. And it's something that I will go into later on. It's the words of Winston Churchill in Fulton, Missouri in 1946. So watch that, find out what he's on about when we talk about that, and we'll cover that again later on because you will need it for the next task. So pause the video, find the link on the description and watch it, and then you should know exactly what the Iron Curtain is. Anywho, let's rock and roll. Let's rock and roll. Keep going, keep going. Lovely. Right, here we go. So we're now going to apply some of this knowledge to some sources. It's going to be slightly different than what we did last week. You looked at one source last time, beg your pardon. You looked at a source and you thought about, right, how do I show that I understand it? This time what you need to do is you need to compare two different sources, and you need to compare them and think about what they can both tell us. And the thing we're thinking about is opinions about the spread of communism in Europe after the Second World War. So we're thinking about how it was viewed by different countries, perhaps. Okay, so we've got two sources here, and collectively we're thinking about what these sources can tell us about opinions about the spread of communism. So let's rock and roll with this. Remember, let's focus on source A to begin with. The first place you go to, remember, is that caption. You go what, you go when, you go who, and you go why. I will put a PDF on ePraise. If you do have the luxury of a printer, I appreciate many of you don't have that luxury, myself included. If you want to print it off and stick it on your page, that is absolutely fine, and you can label it like so, but you don't need to. You can just jot down these ideas as you go. So what was the source? When was the source made? Who made the source? And why was the source made? Have a pop at answering those questions, and I'll check in just a moment. Now, to those of you who have maybe cheated, and to those of you who have done this, this should all be good. Right, so we're thinking about what is the source. Well, the source is obviously a cartoon. This piece of evidence is a cartoon, and it was made in 1946. Now, remember, you've always got to put that into context. It's all very well saying 1946, but what the heck was going on in 1946? So we know that the Second World War is over. We know the atomic bomb has been used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that has forced the Japanese to surrender. And we know that by 1946, communism has crucially spread across Europe. And you can add in there, if you've watched that video in 1946, that Churchill has made in March 1946, beg your pardon, I said May earlier on, I thought, no, I don't think, anyway, forget it. Basically, you're thinking about at this point that Churchill has basically made his Iron Curtain speech, all right? So we're thinking about who made the source. Well, it was a British cartoonist. This is going to show a British view. It's therefore going to show a capitalist view. And why was the source made? Well, just like all political cartoons, it was made to make a political point. In part, it was made to entertain, yes, but primarily it's to make a political point. So now what we want to do is we want to think about the key aspects of this and actually what is the meaning behind the things that they are showing. So I've circled some of the things that I think are important. And what I want you to do is I want you to have a think about those and think about what the meaning might be. Particularly have a think about what is the purpose of a curtain. And then we will talk about it some more in just a moment. So I'll be back in 5. Pause the video, have a pop at thinking, trying to make those inferences, take this source to pieces and try and understand what the heck this is going on about. Okie dokie, right. We have got Europe here. So Europe is this sort of this land here, and you can see descending right across Europe is, and if you can just see the top here, it is a curtain. And you might be able to get an idea from the texture shown in the cartoon that this curtain is, of course, made of iron. This is an iron curtain. And the iron curtain says on it, no admittance. You might have heard that phrase before. No admittance means no entry. You cannot enter this part of Europe. That's what it's getting at. By order of Joe, you might have worked out that actually Joe is, of course, no longer Uncle Joe, as he was affectionately called in America during the Second World War, but in fact it is Joseph Stalin, the same person, but the attitude is very different. It is Joseph Stalin, the Premier of Russia. Okay, and what has happened is, this is arguing that Joe has ordered a curtain to be put across Europe. Now that symbolizes a divide, doesn't it, between Western Europe on this side, because Truman's going to be on Churchill is going to be on Western Europe, and we'll talk more about him in a second. And on the other side, well, you might be able to guess from that flag, and just from your own knowledge, that is going to be a communist Eastern Europe. Now take a step back and think about, right, what is the purpose of a curtain? The purpose of the curtain is really quite straightforward. Well, you have curtains in your window, yes, and you have curtains in your shower, I suspect. You might do. And the reason why is because a curtain is designed to cover things up, isn't it? If you didn't have curtains in your window, you could get any old fruitcake coming along and having a peep when you watch a telly or something like that, all right? And that would be all kinds of weird, and we don't want that. So the idea is to keep people out, isn't it? And to keep people from looking in, crucially. And this is exactly the metaphor that Churchill is going for. Why does he use the Iron Curtain as a phrase to use? Well, what he's saying is he's using a metaphor because there is not literally a curtain descending across Europe. What is happening is it is describing Stalin's wish to hide what is going on in Eastern Europe. It is concealing what is going on behind there in Eastern Europe, okay? And that is the key point. Hidden behind that curtain, we do not know what is going on. But you can infer that from what is going on here in the background is that the factories, the smoke and things like that, that demonstrates to me, looking at this cartoon, that communism is growing in strength and power, and it is something that should be feared and suspected. And of course, Churchill down here is peeping under the Iron Curtain. He cannot break down the Iron Curtain, he cannot break the Iron Curtain, he can merely peek and sort of get an idea of what is going on. Even he is not allowed through here. So it is demonstrating here, I think, the danger of the Iron Curtain and the threat of communism across the other side. Remember, the Iron Curtain is a metaphor. Now, if we go to the second source, okay, we are going to look at the second source, source B, and we are going to do that process again. Now, to speed things up a bit, I have already done the what, when, who, why for you. Now, I would suggest that this may not, if it is a speech from Stalin in response to Churchill's comments in 1946, I would suggest that actually this is going to show quite a different view, okay? Remember, 1946, we know that context is exactly the same, but crucially the difference is it is made by Stalin, it is made by the communists. So it's going to show a very different view. So what I want you to do is I want you to break down this here, okay? As you might want to pause this video and just have a read of this before I go forward. And I want you to try and break down what is this source getting at, what is the meaning behind this source before we move on and think about answering some key questions on both of these sources. So if you want to read it, I suggest you do, pause it, and then I'm going to rock and roll. Okay, so you've got source A and you've got source B. What you want to do now is you do not need to stick these sources in or whatever. You don't need to do any of that. What you do need to do, however, is you need to answer those key questions. Okay, so you need to think about what is this source, how does this source, beg your pardon, view the Iron Curtain? How do you know? Use the details from the sources. Source A is going to be really straightforward because you've already done that. And how do you know? Give knowledge what was happening. So you need to think about the view of the West. How did the West, capitalism, how did it view the spread of communism through Eastern Europe? We've talked about that already. Source B is slightly different, isn't it? Okay, so we're thinking about you're doing the same process, but it is a communist view. It's probably going to show things differently. Give your knowledge. Tell me. Look back at the beginning of the lesson if you need help. Tell me how this was viewed by Stalin and why Stalin chose to pursue this course of action. So that's what I want you to do, and I'm going to move on in just a second to the next part of this lesson. So pause the video and have a pop at answering these questions. So the key thing, I think, overall, what do these sources tell us? Well, overall, the sources, you should be getting the idea that they demonstrate the conflict of opinions about the spread of communism in Eastern Europe, doesn't it? They show two very different opinions. Source A sees the Iron Curtain as a threat. They see the spread of communism as something that should be suspected, and they see it as a danger to the existence of freedom and democracy in the West. However, B is a very different perspective, isn't it? You can see that from what Stalin is saying in his speech, that essentially he's referring back to the attack on Russia during the Second World War because of Germany being able to march through those countries in Eastern Europe and launch Operation Barbarossa. And it essentially hammers home the point that this is all about, in his perspective, security. It is about securing the safety of Russia and the Russian people by making sure that those countries in Eastern Europe are supportive of the USSR, and the way to make them supportive is basically to make sure that they are communist. If you have capitalism next door, remember, that is a direct threat to the very existence of the USSR, according to Stalin. So you are getting here a real clash, a real polarization, if you will, of ideas and opinions about the spread of communism in Eastern Europe. And if you want to link back to that bigger ideological difference between the two, I suggest that is not a bad shout at all. Now, I'm going to move on and I'm going to think about Western Europe, okay, here, because remember, communism is spread across Eastern Europe, but what about Western Europe? And we need to think about the key things here. Western Europe remains capitalist. It is not taken over by communism in Russia. However, Western Europe has its problems. Western Europe has a problem after the Second World War in the fact that, just like Eastern Europe, Western Europe has been totally devastated in many areas, particularly places like France. France was totally decimated because it was, at one point in the war, half of it was occupied by Germany. It was controlled by Germany. You know, Western Europe had its problems. Shortage of food and clothing, shortage of fuel and energy supplies, devastated infrastructure, buildings, roads, homes, etc. You had the issue of debt. These countries had, governments had spent out millions and millions and millions and millions of pounds on fighting this conflict. That money can no longer be used to actually address the social problems, the problems affecting people after the Second World War. You've got refugees, okay, that have fled their countries and been displaced because of the conflict. You know, huge problem. So the real situation in many Western European countries is one of desperation. It is a time of crisis. Now, I am going to hope that a light bulb might be going off in some of your brains here. Remember what people do in times of crisis. Think about what happened in Germany after the First World War, and particularly after the Wall Street crash a decade later in 1929 and into the 1930s. Who did they turn to? Well, you should be shouting to me. They turned to Nazism, didn't they? They turned to fascism. They turned to the extremes. Now, in Western Europe, fascism has been defeated after the Second World War, but there is one possible extreme solution to all of these problems. and that would be communism. And if communism could solve the problems, particularly as Marxism and communism spoke to the problems of poverty and issues around homelessness, etc., and the inequalities that existed, this would seem very, very desirable to many, many people who were desperate to resolve the problems of post-war Western Europe. Now, who might be slightly worried about this? Well, I think the United States would be particularly worried about this. So the answer to all these problems is, in a nutshell, money, isn't it? Who could provide this money? Who could provide this money to solve all of these problems? Well, it can't be Western Europe. Western Europe is in debt and it's been devastated after the Second World War. They're in no position to rebuild. There is someone, however, more suited to be able to provide help, and that is the United States. The United States, much like the First World War, they did not enter the Second World War immediately. They had a couple of years, or a year, 18 months or so, whereby actually they were totally out of the war. And therefore they were less devastated. And of course, geographically, you've got the geographical element of America is the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, not hugely affected by the conflict in Western Europe. And in fact, many aspects of their economy had actually grown. Factories had created more employment, more taxes, etc., etc. So billions of dollars would be pumped into Western Europe. And this builds on, if I go back, this builds on something we talked about earlier on. And that is the Truman Doctrine. It builds on the Truman Doctrine. Remember, Truman said that what he would do is he would help anybody resisting communism in Europe or around the world after the Second World War. And the best way to provide that help is money. And it was Marshall Aid. George Marshall, the Secretary of State, what he did was he came up with this idea of pumping billions of dollars into Europe in particular to make sure that they did not turn to communism, so that they can rebuild their roads, their infrastructure, try and deal with some of the debt crisis, some of the debt problems that they had. And then what they will be able to do is then create that stability, which means there would be no need for these countries to turn to communism. Now, it's all about perception, of course. How would this be perceived by both Truman and by Stalin? So I think you might want to jot down these ideas that you might have. And there is a think bigger question. It is the idea of something called dollar imperialism. What is this, or what could this actually mean? Have a think about this and pause the video, and I'll get back to you in 5. Okay, so what do we think? Well, it's all about perception, isn't it? For Truman, it is all about a necessary thing to do. It is a good thing. It is a noble thing. It's a heroic do to give this money to Western Europe so that they do not fall into the hands of tyranny. For Stalin, on the other hand, it is a threat, isn't it? It is a direct intervention of America into European affairs in particular. And that is something that Stalin desperately does not want to happen. He doesn't want the United States to be interfering in Eastern Europe, or Western Europe, beg your pardon, because it is a direct threat to communism, isn't it? Remember, communism is just next door to Western European capitalist countries. If they can revive, it could threaten his sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. And it would demonstrate that capitalism would be getting stronger and could pose potentially a real threat to Stalin in Eastern Europe. Now, a lot of communists and a lot of socialists would sort of say that this is an example of dollar imperialism. What might that mean? Well, it's quite simple. Dollar imperialism is all about, well, imperialism is about empires. So what people accuse the United States of doing is creating basically a new empire, whereby Western Europe was now reliant on Truman and his money and American intervention, and therefore they were sort of unable to express themselves freely. And the point is that they were reliant on America, and therefore basically America had a hand in what went on. They had an element of control over what was going on in those Western European countries. So that is what is meant by dollar imperialism. So there's quite a few ideas here. There's quite a few key terms that we've sort of encountered today. And containment is something I do just want to touch on really quickly. Remember, Stalin wanted to contain communism by trying to prevent the spread, of communism throughout Eastern Europe. There are a lot of key terms there. I'm going to give you a quiz. It's going to be a very informal quiz at the beginning of the next lesson. And I'm only going to do a couple more lessons because we're nearly at the end of term. Woohoo! And what I want us to do is I want you next time to have a think about these, try and remember them for next time so you can kick off the next lesson by basically trying to complete an empty table. Okay, that's what I want us to kick off with next time. Okay, obviously it's very informal, but these are terms that are going to be really helpful to you in September, so it might be a really good idea to get your heads around some of these, particularly things like containment, the Truman Doctrine, and expansionism. So that is going to be me signing off now. I hope this has been helpful. Don't forget, send any work that you do to your history teacher, because then you can get the credit that you deserve. I shall be back with another lesson very, very soon, before the end of term, definitely. We'll be looking at where we go next with our story. So, okay, yeah, that's it. I wish you all the best. Good luck with it. If you need any help, don't forget you can email your teachers. Stay safe and take care, and I shall speak to you very, very soon.